We think we know the story. The dark robes, the shadowed chambers, the whispered accusations, the Spanish Inquisition. The very name conjures images of suffering, of a monolithic power, crushing dissent in the name of God. And at the heart of this grim tableau, we picture the instruments of that power. The rack, the thumbscrews, the Iron Maiden. These are the icons of cruelty we've seen in countless films and books, the shorthand for a bygone era of barbarism. But what if I told you that our popular understanding, our collective nightmare of the Inquisition, is a pale shadow of the reality? What if the true horror lies not in the devices themselves, but in the chillingly systematic and psychologically devastating way they were employed? What if the most sadistic aspects of the Inquisition's torture were not the spikes and the blades, but the calculated destruction of the human spirit? A process so refined, so insidious, that it left scars far deeper than any physical wound. Forget what you think you know. We're not just talking about pain. We're talking about a level of calculated cruelty that bordered on the scientific. A methodical dismantling of a person's identity, their faith, their very sanity. This is the story of how the pursuit of religious purity spiraled into a bureaucratic machine of suffering, and how the instruments of that suffering were designed not just to break bones, but to shatter souls. To truly understand the depths of this depravity, we must first step into the world of 15th century Spain. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was complete. Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs, now presided over a newly unified but deeply fractured kingdom. Their dream was one of a homogeneous Catholic state, a limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. But this dream was haunted by the specter of the other, the thousands of Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity. The converts and Moriscos, were their conversions genuine, or were they heretics, secretly practicing their old faiths, a fifth column threatening the very soul of Spain? This was the fertile ground from which the Spanish Inquisition sprang in 1478. It wasn't a chaotic mob, but a formal institution of the state, sanctioned by the Pope, yet controlled by the crown. It was a bureaucracy of belief, with tribunals, inquisitors, and a labyrinthine set of rules. And at the core of its methodology was the pursuit of confession. A confession was everything. It validated the Inquisition's existence. It justified its methods, and it provided the names of other supposed heretics, feeding the machine and allowing it to grow. But how do you secure a confession from someone who may, in fact, be innocent? The answer, as the Inquisition would demonstrate with terrifying efficiency, was through a carefully calibrated application of physical and psychological torment. Let's begin with the very architecture of fear. Before a single instrument was touched, the process of degradation began. An individual would be roused from their sleep by the familiars, the lay officials of the Inquisition. There would be no explanation, no warrant presented in the way we'd understand it. Just a quiet, implacable summons. You were taken from your home, your family, your life, and plunged into a world of silence and uncertainty. The Inquisition's prisons were not like common jails. They were designed for isolation. The accused were often kept in solitary confinement for months, sometimes years, before their trial even began. They were forbidden from speaking, from seeing familiar faces, from knowing the specific charges against them. This was the first stage of the torture, the slow, corrosive drip of psychological isolation. The silence was a weapon, breeding paranoia and despair. The uncertainty was a canvas onto which the prisoner's worst fears would paint themselves. Imagine it, you are alone in a cold, damp cell. The only sounds are the distant clang of a heavy door, the shuffle of unseen feet. You don't know why you are here. You don't know who accused you. Your accuser's identity was a closely guarded secret of the Inquisition, a rule designed to encourage denunciations and prevent reprisals. So you sit in the crushing silence, your mind racing. Was it a business rival, a spurned lover, a neighbor with whom you had a petty dispute? The Inquisition's net was cast so wide that anyone could be an informer. This deliberate cultivation of paranoia was a key part of the process. It turned society against itself, fracturing communities and fostering an atmosphere of pervasive distrust. Your own mind becomes your tormentor, replaying every conversation, every interaction, searching for the source of your downfall. When you were finally brought before the inquisitors, you were already weakened, disoriented. The tribunal chamber was designed to intimidate. The inquisitors, often a jurist and a theologian, would be seated on a raised platform, clad in their imposing robes. They were the embodiment of unimpeachable authority, the arbiters of your fate, both on earth and in the hereafter. And they would speak to you in a calm, almost paternal tone, urging you to confess for the good of your soul. This was the demonestación, the admonition. It was a carefully staged piece of psychological theater. They weren't screaming at you. They were reasoning with you, offering you a path to redemption. All you had to do was admit your heresy. But what if you were innocent? What if there was nothing to confess? This is where the true sadism of the system revealed itself. To the inquisitors, a denial of guilt was not proof of innocence. it was evidence of obstinacy. It was a sign that the devil had a firm grip on your soul, and that more persuasive methods were required. The decision to proceed to torture was not made lightly, at least not on paper. There was a formal process. A physician would be called to assess your physical fitness to endure the ordeal. This wasn't an act of mercy. It was a pragmatic measure to ensure you didn't die before you confessed. The proceedings were meticulously documented by a notary. Every scream, every plea, every shattered bone, recorded in dispassionate, bureaucratic language. This created a veneer of legality, a chilling record of state-sanctioned atrocity. Now, we come to the devices. And while the Iron Maiden is largely a myth, a 19th century fabrication, the reality of what was used is far more disturbing. The Inquisition favored a relatively small number of instruments, but they were chosen and applied with a terrifying understanding of human anatomy and psychology. Let's move beyond the familiar and look at the specifics. Consider the toca, or the water torture. This was a particularly favored method. The victim would be strapped to a board or a ladder, their head tilted back. Their mouth would be forced open, often with a piece of iron or cloth. Then, a linen cloth, the toca, would be placed in their throat, and water would be slowly poured onto it. The cloth would guide the water into the stomach and lungs, creating the sensation of drowning. The victim would gag, choke, and convulse, their body convinced it was suffocating. The notary's records from this procedure are clinical and horrifying. They describe the prisoner's frantic struggles, their desperate pleas for the torment to stop. The psychological impact was immense. It was a controlled, prolonged experience of death, and the inquisitors could pause the process at any time, ask again for a confession, and then resume the ordeal if the desired answer was not forthcoming. It was a terrifying dance on the edge of oblivion. Then there was the garuca, or the strappado. This was a test of the shoulders and a lesson in agony. The prisoner's hands would be tied behind their back, and the rope would be looped over a pulley on the ceiling. They would then be hoisted into the air, their arms wrenched from their sockets. The pain would be immediate and excruciating. But the true sadism of the garuca lay in its variations. Sometimes, weights would be attached to the victim's feet, increasing the strain on their arms and spine. And then there was the drop. The prisoner would be raised to the ceiling and then suddenly released, only to be jerked to a halt. Before they hit the floor, the jolt would send a wave of agony through their dislocated shoulders and could cause fractures and nerve damage. This was not simply about causing pain. It was about demonstrating absolute control over the victim's body, the ability to inflict unimaginable suffering with a simple tug of a rope. And what of the potro, the rack? While we imagine a large, wooden frame, the Spanish potro was often a more compact and, in some ways, more insidious device. It was a wooden trestle with sharp, V-shaped rungs. The victim would be laid upon it. Naked, their limbs would be bound with cords. And then, with each denial of guilt, the executioner would turn the handles, tightening the cords. These cords, the cordeles, would bite deep into the flesh, constricting muscles, cutting off circulation. Sometimes, the cords themselves had knots tied into them, concentrating the pressure on specific points. As the tightening continued, the prisoner's body would be forced against the sharp rungs of the potro, causing intense pain in their back and limbs. The executioner could apply pressure with excruciating slowness, drawing out the agony, giving the inquisitors ample time to repeat their questions, to whisper promises of mercy in exchange for a confession. It was a symphony of pain, conducted with chilling precision. But the physical torture, as horrific as it was only one part of a larger strategy. The true genius of the Inquisition's cruelty lay in its understanding of the human psyche. The inquisitors knew that the threat of pain could be as powerful as the pain itself. The accused would often be shown the torture instruments before the session began. This was the territio, the display of the tools. Imagine being led into a dimly lit chamber and seeing the potro, the jugs of water for the toca. The executioner might explain, in a calm and matter-of-fact tone, exactly how each device worked, what it would do to your body. This was a calculated act of psychological warfare. It was designed to break your will before your body was even touched. For many, the sight of the instruments and the cold, detailed explanation of the agony to come was enough to elicit a confession, true or not, and the cruelty was not confined to the torture chamber. It permeated every aspect of the process. Consider the use of deception. Inquisitors were permitted, even encouraged, to lie to the accused. They could promise leniency in exchange for a confession, only to renege on that promise once the confession was secured. They could present the accused with false evidence, with fabricated testimony from supposed witnesses. A particularly cruel tactic was to place a spy in the prisoner's cell, someone who would pretend to be a fellow victim. This spy would befriend the accused, offer a sympathetic ear, and encourage them to unburden themselves, to confess their supposed sins. The desperate, isolated prisoner, starved for human connection, would confide in their new friend, only to have their words twisted and used against them in the tribunal. This was a profound betrayal, a weaponization of the basic human need for trust and companionship. Even the language of the Inquisition was designed to dehumanize. The accused were not referred to as prisoners, but as reos, the guilty ones. The torture itself was not called torture. It was the question, the question. This bureaucratic euphemism served to sanitize the process, to distance the inquisitors from the brutal reality of their actions. They were not torturers. They were officials conducting a necessary, if unpleasant, part of a legal proceeding. This linguistic detachment allowed them to inflict incredible suffering while maintaining a sense of professional and moral righteousness. And what happened after the confession, whether it was genuine, coerced, or entirely fabricated? The end of the torture was not the end of the ordeal. The confession had to be ratified, usually the next day, away from the torture chamber. The accused, battered, broken, and terrified of further pain, would be asked to confirm their statement. It was a final, cruel twist of the knife, forcing the victim to participate in their own condemnation. The final act of this grim theater was the auto de fe, the act of faith. This was a public spectacle, a lavish and carefully choreographed ceremony designed to showcase the power and majesty of the Inquisition. The condemned, dressed in a penitential garment called a San Benito, would be paraded through the streets. The San Benito was a yellow tunic, decorated with symbols that indicated the nature of the crime and the sentence. For those who were to be reconciled with the church, it might be a simple cross. For those who were unrepentant and sentenced to death, it would be adorned with flames and devils. This was public shaming on a grand scale, a ritual of degradation, designed to sear the lesson of the Inquisition into the collective memory of the populace. The most severe punishment, reserved for relapsed or unrepentant heretics, was to be relaxed to the secular arm. This was another of the Inquisition's chilling euphemisms. It meant being handed over to the state authorities to be burned. At the stake, the Church, in its infinite mercy, did not shed blood. So it outsourced the final act of violence to the temporal powers. The burnings were public spectacles, often attended by huge crowds. They were a brutal and unambiguous message to anyone who might dare to deviate from the narrow path of Catholic orthodoxy. But even for those who escaped the flames, the consequences were lifelong. The reconciled heretic was never truly free. Their San Benito would be hung in their local church, a perpetual reminder of their shame. They and their descendants could be barred from holding public office, from entering religious orders, from marrying into pure-blooded families. The stain of the Inquisition was indelible, a hereditary taint passed down through generations. This was the ultimate expression of the Inquisition's power, not just to punish the individual, but to blight their entire lineage, to erase their family from the respectable ranks of society. So, when we think of the Inquisition's torture, let's not just picture the rack and the strapito. Let's picture the silent cell, the anonymous accuser, the paternal inquisitor who lies with a smile. Let's picture the physician assessing a body for its capacity to endure pain, the notary meticulously recording every scream. Let's picture the spy in the cell, the public humiliation of the auto de fe, the shame that clung to a family for generations. The true sadism of the Inquisition was not just in its hardware, it was in its software. It was a system, a bureaucracy, a psychological process designed to dismantle a human being, piece by painful piece. It was a machine that ran on fear, paranoia, and the absolute conviction of its own righteousness. And this brings us to the most unsettling question of all. How could people, educated men, theologians, jurists, perpetrate such systematic cruelty? The answer is as complex as it is disturbing. They were men of their time, certainly, products of a deeply religious and intolerant age. They believed they were fighting a holy war for the very soul of their nation. But there was more to it than that. The bureaucratic nature of the Inquisition created a diffusion of responsibility. The inquisitor who ordered the torture was not the one who turned the crank. The notary who recorded the screams was merely documenting the proceedings. Each person was a small cog in a large machine, and this allowed them to distance themselves from the ultimate consequences of their actions. This is the timeless lesson of the Inquisition, a lesson that echoes through the darkest chapters of human history, from the witch trials of Salem to the gulags of the 20th century. When absolute power is combined with absolute certainty, when dogma triumphs over empathy, the capacity for human cruelty becomes almost limitless. The machinery of oppression, once set in motion, develops a momentum of its own, and the individuals who serve it can become deaf to the screams of its victims. The story of the Inquisition's torture is not just a relic of a distant, barbarous past. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the poison of intolerance, and the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can be convinced to commit extraordinary evil in the name of a greater good. It reminds us that the most sophisticated instruments of torture are not always made of iron and wood, but of fear, isolation, and lies. And it forces us to confront a chilling truth, that the capacity for such cruelty lies not in some monstrous other, but within the complex, and often contradictory, nature of humanity itself. The shadows of the Inquisition's chambers may have faded, but the lessons they hold are as stark and as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. We must never forget the true nature of its sadism, not to sensationalize the past, but to arm ourselves against its return, for the architecture of fear can be rebuilt at any time, with any materials. And the first step in dismantling it is to understand exactly how it was constructed in the first place.